The evening settled in with the slow quiet of dusk, a kind of creeping silence that stretched across the house like an uninvited guest. The last rays of sunlight dipped beneath the hills, leaving behind a pale orange glow that clung to the sky, reluctant to surrender to nightfall. The house seemed to hold its breath, and I felt the weight of the silence pressing in, thick and palpable. I was in the kitchen, my hands moving in familiar, almost automatic motions as I stirred a pot on the stove. The hum of the old radio was the only sound, a soft murmur in the background, barely noticeable but somehow filling the stillness. Outside, the world was quiet too, the kind of quiet that only comes with the end of a day, when the light fades, and the world feels like it's waiting for something to happen. Ethan had just come home for the weekend, a short break from college, a pause in the life he was building away from me. There was supposed to be relief in his return, a feeling of comfort, but instead, there was this strange weight hanging in the air, an unease that I couldn't shake. The boy I had raised, the one who used to seek my advice, my comfort, had grown into a man I barely recognized, someone who felt familiar and yet, at the same time, completely alien. At 21, he was tall, confident, his eyes sharper than before, his voice carrying a weight that had been absent during his childhood. He was a stranger who knew me better than anyone else. "Dinner's ready," I called out, my voice breaking the silence, sounding smaller than I intended. He appeared in the doorway, his figure tall and solid, his presence filling the space. He leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, studying me with an intensity that made my skin prickle. I forced a smile, gesturing toward the table, trying to brush off the unease rising in my chest. We sat across from each other, and suddenly the table between us felt like more than just a piece of furniture. It was a barrier, a divide that neither of us seemed willing to cross. He talked about his classes, his friends, the professors he couldn't stand. His voice was steady, deliberate, but beneath the surface, there was something more, something I hadn't heard before, a sharpness, a focus that felt too heavy, too intentional. He wasn't just telling me about his life, he was measuring me, weighing every word. "So, college life?" I asked, trying to keep the conversation light. My voice faltered slightly as I tried to meet his gaze, but there was something in his eyes that made it hard to hold my own. "Yeah, it's fine," he replied, his lips curling into a half-smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "But, Mom," his voice dropped, lowering to a whisper as he leaned in, resting his arms on the table. "There's something I've been meaning to talk to you about." My heart stuttered in my chest, and the words hung between us, thick and heavy. I swallowed hard, trying to push down the growing discomfort. His tone was too serious, too intense. In the back of my mind, something stirred, a quiet warning, but I couldn't break the gaze, couldn't look away. "Go on," I managed, my voice barely a whisper. Ethan leaned back, the intensity in his eyes softening, but the focus remained. I think about how things used to be, back when it was just us. Sometimes, I miss it. I miss the way things felt simple, comfortable." A chill traced down my spine. I knew what he meant. I missed it too. There was a time when our lives were intertwined, before distance and years had carved new paths for both of us. But the way he said it, there was something in his voice, something that felt too deep, too vulnerable, and it unsettled me. "I miss it too, Ethan," I replied, my voice wavering slightly. "But life changes. You're building your own path now. It's natural." He looked at me, his gaze softening, but beneath it, I could feel the weight of something unspoken, flickering like a flame just below the surface. "Doesn't mean I don't still need you, though," he said quietly, his words carrying a weight I couldn't ignore. The room felt smaller now, and my chest tightened. His eyes held mine, unyielding, and I felt as though something was shifting between us, something I didn't know how to name. I swallowed, trying to ignore the uncomfortable tension building in my stomach. "I'll always be here for you, Ethan," I said, my voice sounding thinner than I intended. His gaze didn't falter, and for a moment, I felt as though he could see past every shield I'd built, every wall I'd carefully constructed to keep the world at bay. His scrutiny was too sharp, too intense, and I found myself questioning whether I was still the person he thought I was. "Are you okay, Mom?" he asked softly, his voice gentle, but there was an edge to it, a depth that made my heart skip a beat. I smiled, but it felt hollow. Just tired, long week, you know? He didn't buy it. His eyes were too sharp, too knowing, and I realized, in that moment, that I wasn't fooling him. He saw through every pretense, every attempt to hide the cracks I thought no one would notice. We finished dinner in a silence that felt forced, the clink of silverware loud in the stillness. I stood to clear the plates, eager for something to break the tension, but Ethan stood too, moving to take them from my hands. I got it, he said softly, his fingers grazing mine as he took the plates. The touch lingered for a moment too long, and I felt a jolt of electricity run through me, a warmth that I couldn't explain. I pulled my hand back, looking away quickly, hoping he hadn't noticed the sudden catch in my breath. I muttered a quiet, thanks, and moved toward the living room, desperate to put some space between us. The dim light in the living room felt like a balm for my racing heart, but Ethan followed me, settling onto the couch beside me. We put on a movie, something old, something familiar, but my mind was elsewhere. Every time I glanced at him, I saw how different he had become, how much more distant he seemed despite his presence. The boy I once knew was gone, replaced by this man who was both too familiar and not familiar enough. And then, just as I thought I might finally settle into the comfort of the movie, Ethan shifted closer. His knee brushed against mine, and I felt a spark, sharp and unsettling. My pulse quickened, and I tried to ignore the electric tension between us, but it was impossible. "Mom," he said, his voice barely a whisper. I turned to face him, forcing my expression to remain calm even as my heart pounded in my chest. "Yes." He hesitated, his eyes locked onto mine. There was something in his gaze, something that made the air between us feel thick, heavy, charged. His hand reached out, almost instinctively, and his fingers brushed against mine. The touch was light, gentle, but it felt like 1,000 unspoken words hung in the air between us. I pulled my hand away, forcing a laugh that sounded more nervous than anything else. "You're being mysterious, Ethan. Just spit it out." He didn't smile. His eyes stayed fixed on mine, serious, thoughtful. "I don't know how to say this," he began, his voice low, like he was trying to find the right words. "Being away at college, everything changed. I feel like I'm losing something." My heart skipped a beat, and the words hung in the air, unspoken but understood. "Like what?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, though part of me was afraid to hear the answer. "Like us," he said softly, his voice breaking with a raw honesty that shook me to my core. I felt the weight of his words sink into me, settling heavy in my chest. I missed it too, the closeness, the simplicity of our bond. But now, hearing him say it, it felt different. The distance between us, the changes, all of it had taken a toll. "I miss it too, Ethan," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, though I wasn't sure if I meant the words or just the idea of them. The room felt smaller now, the air thick with something unspoken, something fragile. Ethan's gaze softened, and for a moment, everything else disappeared. It was just the two of us, caught in this silent moment that seemed to stretch out forever. He spoke again, his voice low and thoughtful. "Sometimes I wonder if things would have been different, if I hadn't left." His words hung between us, heavy with meaning, and I felt a shift, a tension that made the room feel smaller, closer. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "Going to college was the right decision, Ethan," I said firmly, though my voice wavered just slightly. "You're building a life for yourself. That's important." He nodded, but there was a shadow in his eyes, something unsaid that lingered between us. "I know," he said softly. "But it doesn't make it any easier." I didn't know how to respond. I had always prided myself on being strong, on knowing what to say. But tonight, I felt lost. I felt like I was standing on unfamiliar ground, unable to make sense of the feelings rising inside me. His fingers brushed mine again, a soft touch, lingering just long enough to make my heart race. My thoughts scattered, and I realized that the lines between us were no longer clear. The space we had once carefully maintained had started to blur, and I didn't know how to bring it back. Do you ever wonder about the choices we made? He asked softly. His voice was almost a whisper, and it felt like he was reaching for something I wasn't sure I was ready to face. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my emotions in check. I try not to look back too much, Ethan, I replied quietly. What's done is done. He didn't look away. But sometimes, I just think, what if things had been different? I felt the weight of his words, heavy in the space between us, and I realized that he was searching for something I couldn't quite understand. Different how? I whispered, barely able to speak, though part of me was afraid to hear the answer. Ethan hesitated, and when he spoke, his voice was soft, almost regretful. Just different. Maybe if we hadn't drifted apart. Maybe if things had stayed the way they were. The room fell silent, and I could feel the weight of his words pressing against me. I wanted to reach for something solid, something to anchor me in the familiar, but the lines had blurred so much, I wasn't sure where to find it. I looked down, my chest tight, trying to hide the emotions that were threatening to spill over. Ethan, I whispered, my voice trembling just slightly, I'm your mother. I'll always be here for you. But we have to remember our place. Our boundaries. His eyes softened, and I saw something there, something raw, something real. He nodded, slowly, and for a moment, the tension between us lifted, just enough for me to breathe. You're right, he said, his voice quiet but steady. This is the way it should be, and just like that, the evening shifted. The heavy emotions that had threatened to drown us began to settle, replaced by something quieter, simpler, a sense of understanding, of acceptance. The next morning, Ethan packed his bags and prepared to return to college. I watched him leave, a strange sense of relief filling me as the door closed behind him. The house settled into its familiar quiet, and I realized that, for the first time in a long while, I felt at peace. The boundaries had been set, the lines redrawn, and what had once been a confusing mess of emotions now felt clear. Our bond remained, steady and unbreakable, but now defined by who we were to each other, and nothing more.